Okay, everybody's quiet down. Anyway, again, today it's my pleasure to introduce the Schweppe Public Lecture Series. So this is the Lowell Randall Schweppe Endowed Lecture Series in Marine Science. And it's great to have Ann Ashman here today, who is the daughter of both Laura and Irving Schweppe. So anyway, through a generous donation in 1998, Dr. Irving Schweppe Jr. and his daughters, Ann Ashman and Jane Scott, endowed the Laura Randall Schweppe Endowed Lecture Series in Marine Science at the University of Texas Marine Science Institute. The series honors the memory of a wife and mother that had a lifelong love of the marine environment, and especially around Port Aransas, where they have a home. The lecture series brings accomplished scientists to the Marine Science Institute to interact with the faculty, staff, and students, and especially to foster new ideas and research collaborations.
So it's my great pleasure to introduce Antonio Rodriguez, or Tony Rodriguez, who'll be visiting us from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, where he was the director of the Morehead City field site, so the Institute of Marine Sciences there for many years before moving to Chapel Hill last year, where he's now going to be the new chair of the Department of Earth, Marine, and Environmental Sciences starting in July. And Tony grew up in Connecticut, in Freeport, Connecticut, and then did a bachelor degree at Hamilton College in geology, and before moving to Texas back sometime in 1993 or 4. And there he went to Rice University and did his PhD with John Anderson, who was our Schweppe speaker a couple of years ago, and did some of the really groundbreaking work here on the Texas coast, characterizing the history and evolution of our coastal bays, including Corpus Christi Bay, right here in our backyard. So if you look at some of the groundbreaking work that was done, a lot of it was first authored by Tony as a PhD student with John Anderson. He then was an assistant professor at the University of Alabama at Tuscaloosa in 2000 and stayed there until 2005 before going to the University of North Carolina and then going through all the ranks up to full professor. His research is extremely interdisciplinary on a wide range of timescales from past millennia, evolution of coastal environments, and also deals with some very imminent and important topics of today, such as sea level rise, ocean acidification. He's done a lot of work on the carbon burial, salt marsh, seagrass, and oyster reef habitats, the impacts of upstream developments and environmental changes on downstream coastal depositional environments, and also the response of barrier islands to sea level rise and storms. So all topics that are incredibly important also to us here and to people who are, most of us who are working here at UTMSI. With that, it's my great pleasure to introduce then today's talk, which will be on the response of intertidal oyster reefs to sea level rise.
That was a very nice introduction. Thank you for inviting me here. I really enjoyed my time so far. You have a very impressive lab. For those of you who haven't seen many field sites at the coast, you have one of the better ones. I should give you a tour of our lab, which could probably fit in this room. But anyway, all right, so response from intertidal oyster reefs to sea level rise. This is what one of the reefs in the study looks like. There's a little channel, there's a reef right on the other side. Do you want to start off? Because if I run out of time, I don't want to miss the acknowledgements, but I didn't do this work all by myself. It's a lot of work. It was teams of students. I'm going to be talking about a variety of different projects. And it's not just intellectual work, but just shoveling shell, doing the pouring. It's very labor intensive. So I wanted to mention at least Justin Ridge. We started this work maybe in 2010, and Justin's been there the whole time. He's now the research director at our near site. Molly Bost works at NOAA now. Joel Fawdry is the director of the Institute of Marine Sciences now, and he's worked on all aspects of this project with me. Mostly, this work hasn't been very well funded. It's mostly local sources that have funded this work. The only federal source here is the USCRP, and just recently, they decided to fund some of it. And that's not for lack of trying. Lots of rejections. So North Carolina Sea Grant, Division of Marine Fisheries, this APNEP program, which is local, and our near site has provided some funding. And then these are all the present students that are working on this. So like Naomi's an undergrad, and she was working on part of this. Eve is working on oyster reefs right now for part of her PhD. Josh. Anyway, this is just, again, a small, probably 50 other students have contributed to this work. All right, I don't usually get to give this talk in front of a marine science audience, but I really like the marine science audience because you know this, that oyster reefs are really important. And these are just going through some of the importance of oyster reefs. They filter the water, and that's really important. So they decrease turbidity in the water, increase clarity, and that's good for lots of other environments like seagrass that wants clear water to survive and photosynthesize. They denitrify the water. They are important habitat for other species of interest. We're recognizing their importance for shoreline stabilization. And in places like Corpus Christi or North Carolina, we have a very soft coastline. We don't have many natural rocks at the coast. Oyster reefs are a natural hard substrate that can protect shorelines from erosion. And recently, we're talking about their ability to sequester carbon. Some people would characterize them as a blue carbon habitat. Most blue carbon habitats are vegetated, like mangrove, seagrass, and salt marsh. Of course, oysters are not, but yet, so this is a really recent paper I found a couple of weeks ago, and they're talking about the high carbon sequestration efficiency of oysters. This is from a talk that was done recently. Jennifer Pollock, maybe many of you know her. And in her talk, she suggests that maybe we don't really know if they're carbon sinks or not. And so some work that we did shows that they're actually sources of carbon, and other folks argue that they're sinks, and quite disparaging. So this is 19,000 grams of carbon per meter squared. This is negative 710 into the atmosphere. So oyster reefs are important, and like very common story at the coast, right? So many environments are important, and we've degraded them entirely. And oyster reefs are right along that. So NOAA puts out this report: development, wetland loss, excessive nutrient pollution, diseases, overfishing, outdated harvest methods. And then Beck wrote this paper in 2011 and says that we've lost more than 85% of oyster reefs globally. What's the biggest culprit? It's really harvesting. Harvesting is the biggest culprit for the oyster loss. And, using that shell for construction projects too, and not returning it to the estuary after we eat the oysters. So really important. It's been on the decline. I also want to point out that in North Carolina, our subtidal oysters are really different than intertidal oysters. These are the ones you might see in a restaurant. They're beautifully oyster shell shaped. That's what you'd have with oysters on the half shell. These intertidal oysters, this is what I'm going to be talking about mostly today, intertidal reefs. They're of a different morphology. They're long, super sharp. You wouldn't find these in a restaurant because everyone would be going to the hospital. That's how sharp they are. So they're on the decline, and now we're really regretting that. And especially when large storms come by, there's always an article about, maybe the storm damage would have been less if we didn't decimate the oyster population, because those reefs serve as a buffer for storm waves. And Sandy came by and impacted New York City, and then all of these articles and projects started. We're investing millions of dollars in restoring oyster reefs to protect shorelines from erosion. And we do that in a variety of ways. We call these nature-based infrastructure, living shorelines, where you construct a reef just in front of a shoreline, plant a salt marsh behind it, and you restore some of that resilience to sea level rise, resilience to storms, and protection of infrastructure through time. Now, in my mind, whether a restored reef is functioning as intended or not it needs to be growing, right? Just a pile of shell, you could put anything out there and get that same surface, but you really need to have a substrate that's growing. And if that reef does grow and keep up with sea level rise, then it's maintaining that service of shoreline protection with accelerating sea level rise, right? So if it's not growing, sea level is going to increase, and that provision of shoreline protection will go down if it's not growing, because that reef will end up in deeper water. Okay, so some of the questions, and these are just some examples of really small nature-based infrastructure, all in North Carolina. This is close to where I work, and they planted this oyster reef and planted this salt marsh behind it, and this is a few years after that project. Here are some other smaller projects, and you can see this salt marsh that's colonized behind the oyster reef. This one still has a little bit ways to go before that salt marsh fills in the gap. So some of the questions I want to address today: how will oyster reef vertical accretion rates and composition be affected by accelerating sea level rise? Are intertidal oyster reefs self-sustaining solutions for shoreline protection? So do they keep up with sea level rise? And how do they contribute to coastal carbon budgets? And both of these questions, they really depends on accretion rates of reefs. So we can measure how rapidly they grow, and then we can look at how much shell material is there, how much carbon is there, and turn those numbers into fluxes. And that's what I'm going to be presenting today. So in North Carolina, intertidal reefs have been studied for a while. This is a really important study that was done by Pete Peterson and Melanie Bishop in the early 2000s. And what they did is they put a bunch of live oysters in bags. They put these bags on tables at different elevations. This treatment is subtidal. This is low on the intertidal and high on the intertidal. And then they went back and they did measurements on those oysters through time. And this was about a 6-month study. And if you look at dry tissue through time, so the meat in the oyster dried up, that mass increased the most for subtidal oysters. And that makes sense. The oyster wants to be underwater because it needs to filter feed, and it filter feeds for the most amount of time when it's in the subtidal realm. And so you can see that increases these black bars here, or these squares going up. That's the subtidal reef. But if they looked at fouling organisms, so encrusting bryozoans, what's another one? Barnacles, things like that, it was the subtidal oysters that had the most. The intertidal oysters, they're niche. They outcompete those foulers because they're exposed to air for a long period of time, and the other organisms can't deal with that. So it's kind of hinting that in the high salinity parts of estuaries, if you put shell subtidally, you're not going to get an oyster reef. But it didn't quite get there yet. And so what we did is we constructed a whole bunch of restored reefs at different elevations and tracked them over a little bit longer of a time, so just a few years into the future, to see how the reef itself, not just the individual oyster, reacts. And in North Carolina, we are not limited by larval supply. So if you put shell culch in the water in the right conditions, larvae will just attach to it. It will turn into an oyster reef. So this treatment down here, it's we made these reefs we made small reefs, we made large reefs, so 9x7, 5x3 meters. They're just squares. And we put the culch out, and this is what the reefs looked like after a 12-month period. This is the deeper water reefs. So this is like just at that intertidal, subtidal limit at negative 0.9 meters. And then this is mean sea level in this part of the world. This unit here is not just meters, it's NAVD88 is the datum that we used, and about 0 is sea level. In North Carolina, it varies around the world, but that's where we are in North Carolina. And you can see that this reef, high in the intertidal, did the best. This reef that's right at the limit is basically destroyed, and now you can't even tell we have done anything if you visit this place. And if you pull out the oyster clusters, this is what the shell, these are all fouling organisms on the shell. These shells are really healthy from these reefs right here. So clearly, like these intertidal reefs just really thrive in North Carolina in the high salinity lower parts of estuaries. So when you think about reef accretion, we can think about this conceptual model. And there are two parts. We call the middle part of reefs the reef core. It has this outer rind, which is the taphonomically active zone. All that means is this is the transition from live oysters to fossilized oysters. It's the transition between lots of pore space in between those live oysters and no pore space. It's all filled in with sand and mud at depth. This is about, that thickness could be 15 centimeters or a little bit less. So the reef grows through accretion. So we produce shells. That adds to the reef elevation. Biodeposition, so filter feeders, feces, pseudofeces. The oysters repackage small suspended particles into larger feces and pseudofeces that settle to the bottom much more efficiently and get sequestered on the reef. And then we also have allogenic sedimentation. So rivers nearby outside of the reef system get sequestered on the oyster reef. Sediment from outside the system gets sequestered on the oyster reef. And so we've got this balance between these building elevation processes and these tearing down, erosion, bioerosion, dissolution, predation, hydrodynamic processes during storms. And so how fast can reefs grow? I don't know. But we're going to find out, at least in North Carolina, on the few reefs we sampled, and we measured growth in a variety of ways. So here we go. Maybe they'll grow really fast in these 5 time steps and just zoom right up to mean sea level. Maybe they grow much slower and can't keep up. So the first way we did this is we looked at experimental reefs. So an experimental reef, those are those areas we put shell culch down, and then we would revisit it and see, just measure growth. All right. This is where we did it. So here's Cape Fear, Cape Lookout. We're on the North Carolina coast. Right now, we're somewhere down here, right? We're in red there. Our Institute of Marine Sciences, same words, different order than where we are right now. That's located about right there. So we're in the middle of the North Carolina coast, this middle marsh area. Here's a zoom in, and a whole bunch of reefs have been constructed before my time at the Institute of Marine Sciences too. And so in 1997, we looked at these 3 reefs that were constructed then, 2 reefs constructed in 2000, and then the ones that Joel and I constructed in 2011. We had 6 of those. So I'm a geologist, so how do I measure growth? I go in and I take a core and I core through the reef. These reefs are really hard. They're rock hard, literally. And so we had to use a jackhammer, and we put that jackhammer on top of an aluminum tube, and we just jackhammer that tube down, and then we crank it out of the reef, and we end up with a core that looks like this. And it's hard to see. This is the base of the reef. And we would subsample this core every 5 centimeters. We'd wash up the material. This is what the bottom of the reef looks like. And remember this morphology of an oyster shell? This is a subtidal oyster, and that's what they used to plant the reefs with. That's what the culch material was. But the morphology of the shell is really different as you move upward. These are all the new intertidal oysters that are elongate. Okay, so we know when the reef was constructed, when they put the shell out, and we know when we collected the core. And so we can just measure the thickness of the reef and then divide by time, and then we can get a growth rate. Super simple. And that's what we did. This is a bunch of cores from different reefs. This dashed line here is marking the base of the taphonomically active zone. So you can see that it does vary. These are the dates that the reefs were constructed. So this reef has a little bit thinner taphonomically active zone than this one, even though they were constructed at the same time. This dashed line down here, that's the base of the reef in all of the cores. And so if you do this, after about 13 years, the answer is that the reef grew about 2.7 centimeters per year, which is astoundingly fast, but it has to be faster than this. I think it does. Okay, because there's a limit, right? That's not the, here we go. Sorry about that. So that's an unsustainable rate. 2.7 centimeters per year, they're going to grow, right out of the water, and they can't do that. So why I think it's a minimum rate is they grew really quickly, but there has to be some ceiling where they can't extend above, or they'll dry out and die. So we need to think about a different way of doing this. But that rate, it's high and it's promising because it suggests that we can measure growth directly. A 2.7 centimeter, it's something we can use remote sensing techniques. And so we had this terrestrial laser scanner, and we wanted to see if this instrument was appropriate for measuring reef growth. So we made a surrogate reef right here of some known dimension. This is our Institute of Marine Sciences. And we scanned this fake oyster reef 3 times with the laser scanner. And then we made maps, and we subtracted the maps. And these are the results. So here's our fake oyster reef, and we scanned it. This is the point cloud, our 3 trials. And then we made a digital elevation model from that point cloud. And then we subtracted them down here. This A minus B, this is the best result. So the worst it did was, 6 centimeters off, 8 centimeters off. And you take all of that information and you plot it here. And we defined error as 1 standard deviation. It's nice that the data is not biased. So 0 is where we have the most observations. And so we were thinking about 1.4 centimeters as our vertical resolution. So this is an appropriate instrument for measuring growth rate. So we took it in the field, and let's see what we found. Well, first, okay, so this is what it looks like when you scan natural reef. So you can see these circles around here. The laser scanner can't see underneath itself, so you have to move it around and fill in shadows, and that's what we did. So we're kind of zooming across the reef, and you can see all these people. That's us moving the scanner around. We take that out of the scene. So this is what those experimental reefs look like right after we put the material down. And then we scanned it. This is about a year after that material was down. And the red colors, that's high elevation. The blue colors and purple colors, that's low elevation. And then you can see after 2 years, the colors have really changed. And the top of the reef is much redder, indicating that we've got a lot of growth. And when you subtract these 2 maps, you end up with this. And blue is a positive gain, and red is erosion. And the whole reef is showing positive. And look at that. That's 20 centimeters maximum. That was a pretty young reef. We can do this to older restored reefs. So this is what the reef looks like after 10 years and about 12 years. It's not as pronounced. You can see that shift to higher elevations. It's not on top of the reef anymore. It's on the margins of the reef. And here's the subtraction map. So the top of the reef isn't growing much at all. The sides of the reef, that's where we see all of the blue. This is where he collected some cores. This is where a boat ran over the reef. That's the reef, and you can see that scar right in the top. Okay, so you can graph these data, fit a line through it. These reefs, they started off, we put the shell at 15 centimeters, and we have a rate of growth of about 11 centimeters per year from that initial 15 centimeters. And this is kind of a time series, so this is depicting that culch material. And then after just a few years, we have this rapid vertical growth. And then it reaches the ceiling, and then growth shifts to the deeper margins of the reef. And that's when we start getting growth here and growth here. Like, how can oyster reefs grow 10 centimeters per year? Sounds made up. But the live oysters grow on top of each other. Okay. So they're piggybacking. So we have oysters that are growing at a reasonable rate, maybe less than a centimeter a year. But when they're on top of each other, that all adds together. And that's how they grow up so quickly. And that's what's being shown in this figure right here, one of these oyster clusters. So we came up with this growth curve, and we think in North Carolina, we have this optimal growth zone where reefs grow most rapidly between about 20 and 40% aerial exposure. Maybe this is the area you would want to target for restoration if the idea is to get a fast-growing oyster reef as fast as possible. We have this growth ceiling at about 50% aerial exposure, about mean sea level. And then we have this critical exposure boundary, and that's when the shells become fouled and the reef eventually dies and the reef can't grow anymore. And so we thought this was really fun, but does this relate to natural reefs? We've only looked at restored reefs so far. So we kind of expanded this, and we looked at a bunch of different estuaries, and we looked at natural fringing reefs and patch reefs. And this is just an example of 3 reefs nearby that are natural reefs. This is that movie I showed you. That's this reef. And then 2 adjacent reefs to that. And this is just the digital elevation model from one time period. But we went out in 2015 and in 2018, and we're looking at growth over that 3-year period. And so this is reef elevation. This is median growth in centimeters per year. And so on top of the reefs, they didn't grow very much, about at the rate of sea level rise. And then as you move down the flanks of the reefs, you reach this optimal growth zone, and then the growth rates decrease. So even the natural reefs follow kind of that same paradigm that I just showed you. So if you put oyster shell at the right depth, you can have a reef that accretes really quickly. And that's well and good, but I haven't really addressed what about with increasing rates of sea level rise. So we need to think about a different time scale with sea level rise. I can't go out and look at reef growth from one year to the next within someone's master's project or PhD project, right? We need to look back in time and use some geologic tools. So how resilient are oyster reefs to changes in sea level rise? So now you go into the geological literature a little bit and borrow some concepts that we use for coral reefs. And in coral reefs, we have these different phases of growth. And so the first phase is this catch-up phase, and that's where the rate of reef accretion is exceeding the rate of sea level rise. And then we have this keep-up phase, and that's what I think the reefs I just showed you are in. So that's when they reach their ceiling, and they can only match sea level rise. So you need sea level to rise on top of the reef to create space that you can fill up with new oyster shell and sediment. And then you also have this kind of give-up phase, like right here. And the give-up phase is it can't keep up with sea level rise. It transitions to subtidal and then becomes buried eventually in estuarine mud. So we can go to Corpus Christi, Texas. Corpus Christi, Texas is a really great estuary for collecting seismic data for whatever reason. I think there's not that much, and you can correct me if I'm wrong because I haven't measured organic matter, but I don't think there's much gas production in the subsurface in Corpus Christi Bay. And so it's an ideal environment for seismic data collection. And I've tried this in North Carolina, trying to image oyster reefs at depth in places that I know there's an oyster reef at depth, and the data looks awful. So let's look at this example from Corpus Christi Bay. And so here's an oyster reef, and it's growing through time. And this is the bay floor right here. And I've converted this to depth just using the speed of sound in water. A little bit of a scale here. 250 meters. And I can put some interpretation on this. This is all fake, okay? Don't think that this is real. This is just my interpretation of how that reef grew through time. It's never been sampled. But if I were to guess, I think this is the catch-up phase. So the vertical growth rate is really high here, and we have this just vertical straight accretion. And then here, I think it's reaching the reef, the ceiling. And so it can't grow vertical anymore, but it's still producing shell. And now it moves into this lateral growth regime. And that's what we're seeing here. So this is the keep up phase. And then eventually we know this reef gave up because it's not expressed at the seafloor and it's been buried, in about 3 meters of estuarine mud. Okay, back to North Carolina. So in North Carolina, this is a great study spot for looking at rate of sea level rise and oyster reef growth because we have a very well-constrained sea level curve for the area. So Andy Kemp in 2017 published this sea level curve that we're looking at right here. So here's relative sea level centimeters per year through time. And these data are from salt marsh strata. We have lots of salt marsh in North Carolina. And right here in Cedar Island, we have a very thick salt marsh section. Andy went out, he collected this salt marsh core. He knows a lot about foraminifera, and foraminifera, you can identify them and they can tell you where you are in the tidal frame, and you can develop an age depth model and create this very high resolution sea level curve. So something that's interesting about the sea level curve is that for a very long period of time, sea level was almost stable, 0.09 centimeters per year. And then around 1800, the rate started to accelerate to this present day of about 0.24, 0.3 centimeters per year. So we can go and we can find old oyster reefs and see how accretion rates changed during this increase in the rate of sea level rise. So that's what we did. And we included, so these are all natural reefs. Okay, they're all natural reefs. Some are living fringing reef, patch reefs, like this picture here. Some are living fringing reefs, so they share a boundary with salt marsh. And some, too, were fossil reefs. And so remember, seismic data is awful in North Carolina. So how did I find the fossil reefs? It was really happenstance. So we were coring for other projects, and we happened to sample an oyster reef. So we went back out there, and this is what a fossil fringing reef looks like. It's buried in estuarine mud, and it looks like nothing from the surface. We changed the coring technique a little bit, and so we moved to vibra coring. We needed to collect much longer cores. The natural reefs are a little bit softer. This is the rig that we use for vibra coring. And it does go faster at some point. After you get through the taphonomically active zone, it goes down much faster. There we go. Now it's starting to move. And then once it's all the way down, this is the same site. And this is how we get the core back out. And so we take turns on this. Here's Josh. This is a pretty big oyster reef. This reef right here is called Cross Rocks. And the story was that it was called Cross Rocks because Native Americans used to use it as a natural bridge to get across the estuary. So once we have these cores, we subsample them into 5 centimeter intervals. We separate the shell from the fine grain material. We define shell as gravel components. So everything that's coarser than 2 millimeters, we define that as shell. And these are some of the photos of the shell. And then on the finer grain components, we look at loss on ignition to get organic matter. And we convert that organic matter into carbon by measuring, coming up with a curve from elemental analysis of carbon. You can make a calibration or a conversion curve. And then to get at time, we use radiocarbon dating. All right, and then we did this for a bunch of different reefs, 25 reefs in total. Here's that middle marsh I was telling you about again. Cross Rocks was right here. We went in the North River. We also looked at other estuaries. So here's the White Oak River estuary, and we looked at 3 reefs there. We went down here right at the South Carolina border where the tidal range is a little bit different. It's higher. The Charlotte River estuary, we looked at 6 reefs from there. So 25 reefs in total. And we measured accretion rates a couple different ways. So the first way, this is the, I guess, not so smart way, but we had a lot of data that we could measure reef accretion this way. And we call this the interval method. So we know the date that we collected the core, and then we would date an articulated oyster shell at a depth or another depth, and we would just divide the depth between the date of that shell and the age of the shell. So the time that we collected the core and the radiocarbon date, you divide, you get a rate. Here's that sea level curve from Andy Kemp. I know it's kind of dark. These are all of our interval method dates. They're color-coded by estuary. This is reef accretion and relative sea level rise on the same y-axis. So I had to break the axis right here. So a different scale right there. Time, CE, common era, right? Another way of thinking about this is AD and BC, and that the 0 point is exactly the same, but it's a little bit easier to plot this way in common era. All right, I see that as we move towards present, reef accretion rates, overall have increased, right, with sea level rise. So let's zoom in on this part of the curve. There we go. Okay, so this is that part of the curve that's blown up. Now, the data it's not perfect, right? It generally shows this increase in accretion rates through time, but there's a lot of scatter here. And the scatter is like reefs can colonize all different depths, right? As long as you're in the intertidal. So if a reef colonizes high in the intertidal, it has less space to grow. It's going to hit that ceiling really quickly. If it happened to colonize low in the intertidal, it has a whole bunch of space. And that problem I just tried to verbalize gets maximized out here at these time scales, like over the last 100 years. If the reef is thousands of years old, that all gets washed out in time. You'll also notice that the accretion rates are always greater than the rate of sea level rise. You can look at it another way and just compare pre-1800 when sea level was slow with post-1800 when sea level was high. And, overall, you see this increase from, about 2.3 millimeters per year to 7.1 millimeters per year. All right, you can do this a different way. Instead, not the interval method, but you can create an age depth model. Okay, so then you focus on 1 or 2 reefs and you collect radiocarbon dates at different elevations and you create an age depth model like this curve right here. Okay, so here's time, right? Depth in the core. In this example, this is what an increase in reef accretion would look like. All right, so let's look at the data. We did this on the oldest reefs that we sampled. So those included the 4 oldest reefs. And so that includes these fossil reefs right here. So one of these fossil reefs in pink, this is in the Newport River estuary. And this purple one is in the North River estuary. This top here, that's when they were buried in estuarine mud. So no surface expression of these reefs. And you can see that the rates are really small. So less than 1 millimeter or 1 millimeter per year. And the rate of sea level rise was also extremely low during this period of time. And it's also interesting that both of these data sets, they overlie and they're showing a similar story. So let's zoom in on these 2 reefs. And these 2 reefs cover that acceleration in the rate of sea level rise. Oh, I should have mentioned this blue is, again, like that's that sea level curve from Andy Kemp based on salt marsh. Okay, so sea level curve from Andy Kemp based on salt marsh. We've got time, elevation. This is that Newport Reef data. So each one of these dots is a radiocarbon dated oyster shell, and we're moving up the reef to its surface here. That's when we collected the core. We can assume that the tidal range is the same in the past as it is today. It's an assumption. I don't really know what the tidal range was. It could be different. We could have had a different inlet configuration. But that's where mean low water would be with that assumption. And so we think that this oyster reef was started off as a subtidal reef. And it's growing faster than the rate of sea level rise. It entered the intertidal realm. And then when the rate of sea level rise accelerated, so did reef accretion. And that's where we are in the course. So this is just looking at percent shell. And you can see that the percent shell is also increasing through time. So this isn't just allogenic sediment building the reef, but it's shells that's driving the growth. This is what grain size looks like. This Newport River reef is a muddy reef. So most of the grain size in the reef is silt size. A little bit of sand, but that's close to the base because the reef colonized a sandy substrate. We can move to the adjacent estuary, the White Oak River estuary. That's these data right here and this green curve. And again, the accretion rates, they overlie the Newport. We're in a different estuary over the same time period. The rates are about the same. And that reef also started off as subtidal, exceeded the rate of sea level rise, entered the intertidal realm. And when we had that acceleration in the rate of sea level rise, the reef accretion rates also increased. So to about 1.5 centimeters per year after 1800, and before 1800, less than half a centimeter per year. Okay, unlike the Newport Reef, this is a really sandy reef. So very different allogenic sediment supply. All right, now I'm running out of time, and I haven't really talked about carbon at all. So here it is. This is the carbon part. Now we're looking at this scatter plot, and we've got flux of shell to the subsurface. Organic matter in the sediment, that's less than 2 millimeters. So remember, we sampled the cores every 5 centimeters. We sieved that material, shell over here, fine-grained material over there. We measured the organic matter on that fine-grained material, and you can convert all of that into a flux because we have those radiocarbon dates and those accretion rates. And so it looks like, for the most part, the points are colored by time. So the orange points here are 1900 to 1960, and that's when the reef initially colonized. And there's this linear relationship, which I think is really interesting. So what I think this is telling us is that the more shell we have, the more organic matter in the sediment. And that would make sense because the more shell, the more live oysters that are on the reef, the more filter feeding that's going on. And then we also have a bunch of outliers. This guy, it's just at the end of this bin. So honestly, this reef formed around 1955 and really low in the tidal frame. I didn't feel good about making it a red point, but I really wish I could. So that's our outlier reef. It just had a lot of space to grow. Fastest reef accretion rates of any other reef. These two are really young, and it takes a while for the reef to operate like this is not reflective of burial. It's just deposition. This material, I don't know if it's going to stick around for a long period of time. It could be partially eroded and then come back. And that's why these are all outliers. Okay, so with these data, I can turn this organic matter from the sediments into carbon using a conversion that we came up with. And you need to do this in every estuary. People do this all the time for seagrass or salt marsh, so you don't have to spend a ton of money doing expensive elemental analysis. But it's not just the organic matter that's being deposited, but when we create oyster shell, the shell, when it forms, it emits CO2 into the atmosphere. And so we thought that because we're looking at burial, we need to account for that CO2 that went into the atmosphere. If you're thinking about making a carbon budget for a reef, that should be in play. You can't just consider the organic matter. Now, I could give this talk tomorrow and give you another argument that says, no, the shell doesn't matter. We only care about the organic matter. And that's why we get such disparate values in the literature about carbon burial in oyster reefs. So we do account for that. We do ignore respiration. And I'm ignoring that because I don't really know how to parameterize that value. Because I'm looking in the geologic past. I don't know what live oyster density is on the reef 100, 200, or 1,000 years in the past. Okay, so we've got this, and we're almost finished now. So these blue points, they're paired with these orange points. So the orange points, that's burial of organic matter. So that's the carbon from the burial of organic matter as a flux. These blue points, that's the CO2 that's being emitted into the water column from the creation of calcium carbonate. And this is time. So we're going to the restored reefs out here to the fossil reefs on this end. So these are about 4,500 year old reefs. So from negative 200, 2,500 CE to zero. We were pretty carbon neutral. This is a mosaic from a Roman mosaic called Unswept Floor. And look, they didn't sweep up an old oyster shell. They loved oysters back in the day at this time period. And oysters were pretty much neutral carbon budget. And then we move into a little bit closer to present. This is from 1590, a John White, North Carolina Native American drawing, and they ate a lot of oysters. And now the reefs are becoming net carbon sources. Moving into these time periods, so 1900s, that's when we start decimating our oyster reefs, but their rate of growth is increasing and their source for CO2 is also increasing. And then, of course, today, restored reefs, they grow the fastest. Most of that growth is due to shell creation, and that's why CO2 is going into the water column. Oyster reefs are terrible. They're like these little smokestacks. That's not true. All right. So if you take the other side, ignore the CO2 that's being emitted from the shell, and you just look at the organic matter, you can compare that to salt marsh. This is what our oyster reef core looks like. This is the North Carolina salt marsh. And if you measure it using the interval method, we've done this for salt marsh and oyster reef. So before 1800, you can see for both of these environments, the rates are low. So 41 grams carbon per meter square for salt marsh, 25 for oyster reef. And then after accelerating sea level rise, they increase about threefold. Both habitats do. All right, so oyster reefs, they should be able to keep up with any rate of sea level rise. The caveat here is that's assuming that estuarine conditions are suitable for healthy oysters. Okay, that's a big caveat. We're going to get more to, we're going to adjust that in the next slide. As sea level rise accelerates, the vertical growth will rapidly respond, but there'll be ecosystem service trade-offs. So that vertical growth will buffer shorelines better. The utility of reefs for nature-based infrastructure is really high, but their effectiveness as there'll be larger sources of CO2 at the same time. So that could be a trade-off. So we don't want this to be a happy story. So climate change is projected to negatively affect oyster health, and that's what this figure is showing. So we have all of these stressors. Pollution is on the rise. Our estuaries are becoming warmer. They're acidifying. And so all of these changes kind of undermine the remarkable resilience of intertidal reefs to sea level rise. So you really need to be careful. And it's all about where you're constructing the reef. you have to be very careful about where you construct the reef if you want it to keep up with sea level rise. So you need to pick a site that is healthy water, essentially. All right, and that's it.